Here are all of the topics covered in the US Constitution revision videos. This particular video is going to look at a comparison with the UK Constitution, looking at general comparisons as well as how to apply the political theories. Very quickly, remind me, what are the three theories of comparison theory? We have structural theory, which focuses on the institutions in a political system and the processes within them. Next is rational theory, which focuses on the individuals within a political system and the assumption that people will act rationally. Finally, there is cultural theory, which focuses on the shared ideas and history within a political system or group. Now let's apply these theories to the civil rights of both countries. When evaluating the two constitutions, it is perhaps too easy to focus overmuch on their differences, so therefore those examined, it is worth remembering that there is important common ground found in each. First, both fulfill the same function of laying out the framework of democratic politics and accountable political institutions. They also both seek to defend individual rights and deal with issues such as discrimination. Finally, in their different ways, both have adapted to the emergence of mass democracy without the need for a political and therefore constitutional revolution. This is in contrast to some other democracies such as France and Germany, where new constitutions have been implemented following the times of political upheaval. Let's compare Britain and America by looking at the structure and the potential for change of each constitution. Firstly, the UK has an uncodified constitution versus the US's codified one. The UK constitution is easy to amend formally as it only takes an act of parliament. It is best described as flexible, whereas the US Constitution is hard to amend formally, as it requires the approval of supermajorities in both chambers of Congress, and also from individual states. This can be best described as inflexible. It is easy to change and update historic clauses that no longer prove helpful or relevant and are seen as outdated in the UK Constitution. However, it is much harder to remove or revise historic clauses that no longer seem appropriate or desirable in the US Constitution. Parliament, or more accurately the Crown in Parliament, is sovereign in the UK, but in the US the Constitution is sovereign. Finally, there is often a lack of clarity and precision in some roles and practices in the UK Constitution. Hence, convention often becomes very important in the absence of clear and entrenched procedures. But in the US Constitution, the articles of the Constitution are very precise in places. The difference goes beyond nature, however, and are also reflected in how power is distributed. In the US, there is a deliberate separation of powers, wherein the three elements of government power are held by separate branches. In the UK, there is more of a fusion of power in the legislative. Whoever controls Parliament controls the nation. There are checks afforded by their parliamentary party, backbench rebellions, and on occasions, as with Boris Johnson's attempted prorogation of the Parliament. Otherwise, between elections and with a weak second chamber. In contrast, even presidents who enjoy control of both houses of Congress, such as Trump did between 2016 and 2018, can find it hard to push through legislation. The constitutions also have much in common when it comes to how they operate in practice. Political parties and the influence of pressure groups are, for example, similarities shared by both. The table on the screen gives a detailed overview of the common features and differences between the constitutions when it comes to political realities. So if we start with the feature of legislative power, there are similarities that the elected legislator passes all national or federal laws, meaning pressure groups and other groups focus much of their lobbying on Parliament and Congress. A difference between the two, though, is in the UK, the focus is almost entirely on the Commons. In the US, lobbyists and others will target both Senate and House as they have legislative equality. Now, if we look at the feature of executive power, we can see similarities in the fact that the executive plays a significant role in drawing up policies and setting the political agenda. Whether it is Make America Great Again or Get Brexit Done, the President and the Prime Minister both seek to set the political tone. A difference is that in the UK, a Prime Minister with a healthy majority can normally get their agenda through Parliament without major incident. This is trickier for US presidents who have to negotiate carefully and bargain with congressional leaders, even those from their own party. Johnson would push through Brexit legislation in 2020, whereas Trump found it hard to secure billions of dollars required for his proposal of a border wall. Now let's look at the limits on executive and legislative power. Neither President nor Prime Minister can truly be imperial. UK Prime Ministers can sometimes be checked in the Commons, especially by backbench rebellions. US Presidents are often faced by an uncooperative Congress. This demonstrates a similarity between the two. Whereas checks and balances are earthed into the US political system, with vetoes and congressional supermajorities being key features, these are absent from the UK's denial of royal assent, so this shows a clear difference. We can also look at the feature of the role and impact of the judiciary. In both countries, the judiciary can rule against the legislative and the executive. In the UK, the courts have intervened to rule aspects of anti-terror legislation as incompatible with the ECHR, or the prolonged prorogation as unlawful. Whereas the US judiciary is far more powerful and significant in shaping the modern American state. Indeed, landmark cases are a major part of US constitutional and political history, whereas when we look at the UK courts, they do not have the same power to rule acts as Parliament as unconstitutional. We can also continue to look at the role and impact of the judiciary by comparing a similarity in the fact that the US Supreme Court has ruled executive actions such as the line item veto unconstitutional and has struck down some congressional legislation such as certain clauses of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act in 2002 in the 2010 Citizens United case. A difference can be that Parliament, as unconstitutional, can only issue declarations of incompatibility with regard to the EU law or the Human Rights Act. The US Supreme Court, therefore, is a major focus for lobbying by interest groups with amicus curiae briefs. This reflects the fundamental difference between parliamentary and constitutional sovereignty. Finally, we have the feature of devolved and federal government. Although there is a tendency to focus on DC and Westminster as being the epicenters of power, in reality, much decision-making takes place in regional assemblies or state capitals. This means that a lot of campaigning goes on for elected officers in these places, and also they are important targets for pressure groups to influence. A difference can be that devolution in the UK, whilst growing in significance, remains far less important than the wholly federal structure of the US. Elections to state legislatives and governorships have long been heavily contested, and these are major access points for pressure groups. Let's compare the constitutions of Britain and America by looking at the cultural and historical context. Starting with its principles. The US Constitution was deliberately formulated with clear principles in mind. It embraces key features such as republicanism and representative government. It is a product of revolution. The British Constitution is a product of centuries of evolution. The British Constitution is also essentially still monarchical, meaning it still involves the monarch's use of prerogative powers, as opposed to the enumerated powers in the US Constitution. There is a sense of vagueness about the US Constitution, where some powers are implied and are not clearly set out. Now let's focus on heritage. In the UK, there remains a legacy of hereditary practice and deference. It can be seen partly in antiquity of some constitutional documents, for example, the 13th century Magna Carta. Also present in the titles of the two legislative chambers, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The US Constitution does not borrow from monarchical or hereditary principles. It took inspiration from aspects of ancient Rome and Greece, note the use of the term Senate. So both constitutions have roots in the past via classical republicanism in the US and traditional monarchism in the UK. Continuing this thought further, we can look at the individual rights and how these are shared with cultural and historical context. The US Constitution is more explicit about their protection of individual rights, and Americans historically have a greater attachment to individual liberty. The UK too has a historic attachment to civil liberties. Several key documents express in different ways the need to limit the ability of the monarch to deny or subvert Parliament, as seen in the Magna Carta and the 1689 Bill of Rights. Neither the UK or US Constitution started off with the intention of protecting the rights and liberties of every man and woman. Federalism versus devolution is another area that we can look at. Federalism is an entrenched principle of the US Constitution and cannot be repealed easily. Devolution was adopted by parliamentary statute, so relevant legislation having been created and sustained only by parliamentary laws means that a subsequent parliament could reverse devolution. Devolution essentially equates to a delegation, not alienation of powers. The US states have greater lawmaking powers than the devolved regions of the UK, for example, and we can look at the death penalty in this case. However, the reach of the federal government has increased markedly in recent decades. US states can still decide the electoral systems they use, and this is becoming more frequently available in the UK. Devolved assemblies get to partially decide their own electoral systems for assembly election across the UK. Devolution in the UK does not apply to the entire nation, but only to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The bulk of the UK lives in England, which does not have its own parliament. Decisions are made by Westminster MPs. The US is uniformly governed by the federal system, and all 50 states enjoy legislative equality. However, state laws must conform with both federal law and the Constitution. There are other areas that you could possibly look at to apply cultural theory. Firstly, let's look at democracy and sovereignty in the two constitutions. Both constitutions are based on democracy, but the shared ideas and beliefs that shape them are different. The US Constitution allowed Americans a much greater role in the electoral process of their nation than the UK Constitution does. The UK Constitution emphasises representative democracy and parliamentary sovereignty, whereas the US Constitution emphasises popular sovereignty. There is also the separation of powers versus fusion of powers. Both provide systems of government that could be described as representative democracies. Both provide for national governments divided into three branches, a legislative, an executive, and a judiciary. Both provide a bicameral legislative, a Supreme Court, fixed-term elections, subnational governments, state governments in the US, and devolved governments for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The US Constitution sets out a strict system of separation of powers, where the UK has a fusion of powers. These differences are largely the product of structural differences between the two systems of government that reflect the cultural differences at work in the two countries. There are three key ways to compare and contrast US federalism and US devolution. First, federalism is an entrenched principle of the US Constitution. This means it cannot be repealed easily. The relevant legislation, having been created and sustained only by parliamentary laws, means in theory, at least, that a subsequent parliament could reverse devolution, although that is extremely unlikely in the current political climate. Devolution essentially equates to a delegation, not alienation of powers. Second, the US states have greater lawmaking powers than the devolved regions in the UK. The death penalty is a case in point. However, the gap between the two systems is declining, and there is growing legislative divergence across the different parts of the UK. However, US states can still decide the electoral system they use, and this is becoming more frequently available in the UK. Devolved assemblies get to partially decide their own electoral systems for assembly elections, meaning there is now a greater variety of systems across the UK. Finally, devolution in the UK does not apply to the entire nation, but only to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The great bulk of the UK's population lives in England, which does not have its own parliament. Decisions are made by Westminster MPs, the power of English councils is tightly circumscribed, and they enjoy nothing like the primary legislative powers of the devolved regional assemblies. By contrast, the US is uniformly governed by the federal system, and all 50 states enjoy legislative equality. However, states must conform with both federal law and the Constitution. Hence, many state laws, such as abortion and those dealing with campaign finance, end up being challenged in the courts.